Please just make it quick, she whispered to the sheriff. The rancher behind him said no. The deed was on the table between them, and I remember the particular sound the sheriff's ring made when he set his hand down on it. Not a slam, just a settling, like he'd done it 100 times and expected the paper to stay where he put it. I was standing back by the stove. Nobody had asked me to stand there. I'd come in with Cora Denning to help her carry 2 boxes of documents she'd been keeping in a trunk under her bed, and after we set them down, the sheriff looked at me like I was a piece of furniture someone had dragged in that didn't match anything else in the room. His name was Arvin Price. He'd been wearing that badge for 11 years, and he'd learned somewhere along the way that 11 years was long enough that a man could stop explaining himself. Cora stood across from him at the kitchen table of the house she'd lived in since she was 19 years old. Her husband Roy had been dead 14 months. She was 34. She had the kind of stillness that women get when they've been frightened for a long time and have decided the only thing left to do is hold themselves very straight. Price said the deed she was holding had an error in the survey line. Said the Bledsoe family's claim predated hers by a filing she'd never been notified about. Said she had until the end of the month. She said, quiet, not to him but sort of to the wall behind him, please just make it quick. Like she was already used to it. Like she'd been preparing herself for it since before I drove her into town. I said no. Price looked at me then. Really looked at me, the way men look at you when they're deciding whether you're worth the trouble of what comes next. My name is Gideon Cole. I was 58 years old that morning. I ran cattle on 420 acres west of Cora's land, had been running them for going on 22 years, and I'd been a widower for 9 of those years. And in those 9 years, I had done my level best to become the kind of man who didn't get involved in things that weren't his business. I had done a very poor job of it. I want to go back a little, because none of what happened that morning makes sense without the fall before it. Roy Denning had been my nearest neighbor for the whole time I'd run cattle out there, which meant we'd had a loose and comfortable friendship built mostly out of fence-line conversations and the occasional loan of equipment. He was a decent man. Not a remarkable one, but decent in the way that counts. He paid what he owed. He didn't let his animals suffer, and he never said a thing to your face that he wouldn't say behind your back. When he died, Hart, they said, out in the south pasture, alone, I drove over that same afternoon because that's what you do. Cora met me at the door. She had her 2 boys behind her, 8 and 10, both of them red-eyed and trying hard not to show it. I didn't say much. I don't remember what I said. I know I helped her bring the horses in from the field because Roy had left them out, and I stayed until after dark making sure the barn was put right and the water situation was handled for the morning. I drove home and sat at my own kitchen table for a while. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has been a widower long enough that he stopped expecting it to lift. I'd been living in that quiet for 9 years. My wife Ellen had died of a fever in the spring of 1871, and I'd kept going because the cattle needed keeping and the land needed working, and I had never in my life been able to locate a good reason to stop. But the quiet was always there. A man gets accustomed to it. He learns to move around inside of it like it's furniture. What I did not expect was that driving home from Roy Denning's farm, that evening would make the quiet louder. I wasn't fool enough to do anything about that. A man my age knows the difference between what a thing feels like and what it is. And what it was grief and proximity, and the particular tenderness a person feels when they see someone else's loss too clearly because they know the shape of it from the inside. So I let it be what it was. I helped when I could, fixed a section of her north fence in October, took a look at her pump when it started pulling muddy in November. We talked the way neighbors talk. She wasn't looking for anything from me, and I wasn't offering anything except what any decent neighbor would have done. Then, sometime around December, things started to shift in ways I couldn't attribute to neighborliness. Cora had a way of saying things that was particular to her. She didn't announce what she thought. She'd say something matter-of-fact and quiet, and it would land in the middle of a conversation, and you'd find yourself still thinking about it 2 hours later when you were back on your own land. One afternoon she said about the boys that she reckoned the hardest part of raising them alone wasn't the work, it was that she couldn't give them a man to watch. Said boys needed to see a man do things. Do them right, and do them without complaining about it. I was fixing a loose board on her front step at the time. I didn't say anything back, but I thought about that for longer than was probably appropriate. January, I had a bad spell with one of my mares. She got into something she shouldn't have and was colicking, and I lost 2 nights' sleep over her. On the second night, Cora came over, unasked, at about 2 in the morning with a lantern and a tin of something she'd cooked, and she sat with me in the barn for 3 hours while I worked the mare through it. She didn't talk much, just sat there on a hay bale with her coat pulled around her and handed me things when I needed them and didn't comment on any of it. The mare made it. When it was clear she was going to be all right, Cora said good and stood up and brushed off her coat and went home in the dark. I stood in the barn doorway and watched her lantern move across the field until it disappeared. That was when I understood that the quiet in my kitchen had changed its character. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was want. And I was old enough and had been hurt enough and had been alone long enough that I knew exactly what to do with want, which was put it somewhere it wouldn't cause problems and leave it there. What I had not accounted for was Harlan Bledsoe. The Bledsoe family had been trying to acquire land in that valley for going on 15 years. Not because they needed it. Harlan Bledsoe had more acres than he could sensibly work. But because he was the kind of man who saw land the way some men see cards. Always wanting one more hand. Always wanting to be the one who decides who gets to sit at the table. He'd had his eye on Roy Denning's parcel for a long time. Roy had rebuffed him twice that I knew of. But Roy was dead now, and Cora was alone, and Harlan Bledsoe was the sort of man who looked at a widow with 2 boys and saw an opportunity dressed up as a problem. I found out what he was doing through Walt Greer, who ran the feed store and knew everything that passed through the county seat. Walt told me in February that Bledsoe had filed some kind of amended survey claim against the Denning parcel, said there was a clerical error in the original deed going back to the territorial days. Walt said he didn't know if it would amount to anything, but that Bledsoe had Arvin Price's ear, which meant it would probably amount to something. I rode over to tell Cora. She was at the table going through Roy's papers when I came in. She'd been going through Roy's papers in one corner or another of that house for months, trying to make sense of what he'd left and what he'd left undone. She had ink on the side of her hand. She listened to me, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I figured something like this was coming." I asked her what she had for paperwork. She had a great deal of paperwork. Roy had been meticulous in some ways and completely careless in others, which is to say he had saved everything and organized nothing. We spent 2 evenings going through the trunk she kept the important papers in, me sitting across from her at that kitchen table, the boys in bed, lamplight, the sound of the wind off the plains, and by the end of it I believed she had what she needed. The original deed, the survey plats, 2 letters from the Territorial Land Office, a tax record going back to the filing. I told her I thought she could fight it. She said she reckoned she'd have to. She didn't say thank you, not in words. But when I was putting on my coat to go, she said, without looking up from the papers she was stacking, "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come over." I said I hadn't done anything yet. She said, "You came over." I drove home in the dark, and the want in my kitchen had gotten considerably worse, and I did what I always did with it, which was go to bed and get up the next morning and work. The meeting with Price was in March. I hadn't planned to go. Cora hadn't asked me to. But the morning of, she came by to pick up the 2 boxes of papers we'd organized, and I looked at her, the set of her jaw, the particular way she held herself when she was preparing for something hard, and I said I'd drive her. She didn't argue. Price's office was in the back of the land office building. He had a deputy there, a young man named Cutter who had the embarrassed look of someone who knows he's watching something wrong and isn't going to do anything about it. Bledsoe wasn't there in person. That was how Bledsoe operated through other people. But his lawyer was, a man named Fitch who had a soft voice and a way of presenting bad news as if it were a favor. Fitch laid out the claim, the survey error, the earlier filing, the legal mechanism by which the Denning land would revert. Cora had her documents. She pushed them across the table, all of them organized and labeled the way we'd organized them, and she went through each one plainly and without her voice shaking, which I know cost her something because I could see the effort in her shoulders. Price looked at the documents the way you look at something you've already decided doesn't matter. Then he put his ring hand down on the deed with that particular settling sound. Said the filing error was material, said the Bledsoe claim was valid under territorial statute, said she had until the end of the month. Cora went very still, and then she said it quiet almost to herself, "Please just make it quick." Like she was done, like she had fought as hard as she could fight and she was accepting what was coming. I heard it go through me like cold water. I said no. Price looked at me, Fitch looked at me, young Cutter by the door looked at me. I walked up to the table and I picked up Cora's survey plat, the original one, filed in 1862, with the territorial seal still clear on it, and I set it in front of Price, and I put my finger on the date. I said, "This deed predates any Bledsoe filing in this county by 6 years. I know that because I've held land in this valley since 1872, and I've had occasion to look at the original territorial records, and there is no Bledsoe claim in them that touches the Denning parcel. What there is a claim that was filed 8 months ago in an amended survey that has not been validated by the territorial office, which you would know if you'd written to them, which I have done, and which Cora Denning did as well, and the response we received is in that box. I had written to the Territorial Land Office in February. I had not told Cora I was doing it. I had done it because it seemed like a thing that needed doing, and I was in a position to do it. Price stared at me, the stare of a man who has just found out the furniture has opinions. I said, "Pull the letter out of the top of that box." Cutter, the young deputy, the one with the embarrassed face, he was the one who stepped forward and opened the box and found the letter. He read the first 2 lines and looked up at Price with an expression I won't forget. Price took the letter, read it, set it down. The room was very quiet. Fitch said softly that there might be some additional legal avenues to explore. I said there might be, and if Harlan Bledsoe wants to explore them, he's welcome to do it in front of a territorial judge, where the original deed and this letter and every document in that box will be entered into the record. That's his choice. But this woman is not leaving her land, and this meeting is over. I'm not going to make myself out to be something I wasn't in that room. I was shaking a little when we walked out, which I hid by putting my hands in my coat pockets. My heart was going harder than it had any right to at 58, and I was fairly certain I'd just made an enemy of the 2 most powerful men in the county. Cora didn't say anything until we were outside and away from the building. Then she stopped walking and I stopped next to her and she looked at me. She said, "When did you write to the land office?" I said, "February." She said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I thought about that. The honest answer was that I had done it because I wanted to, because I could, because watching Harlan Bledsoe take her land was something I was not willing to let happen, and that the reason I was not willing to let it happen was tangled up with things I hadn't said and wasn't sure I'd earned the right to say. I said, "Because it needed doing." She looked at me for a long time. The March light was thin and cold, and there was dust coming off the street behind her, and she had one strand of dark hair that had come loose from where she'd pinned it and was blowing across her face. She said, "Gideon." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'd been trying to figure out how to give up. I'd been practicing it. I was going to hold myself together in there and then go home and tell the boys and then figure out where we'd go." I said, "I know." She said, "You didn't tell me you were doing that." I said, "No." She said, "You just did it." I said, "Yes." She didn't say anything after that. She reached out and took hold of my forearm with both hands just above my wrist, and she held on, not pulling me anywhere, just holding. Her hands were cold, and they gripped hard, the way someone grips when they've been holding themselves together for a long time, and they've found something solid enough to finally let some of the weight go. We stood there in the cold street, and I felt the weight of her hands on my arm and the particular quality of the quiet between us, which was not the quiet from my kitchen. It was different, fuller. After a while she said, "You made Arvin Price look like a fool." I said, "Arvin Price made Arvin Price look like a fool." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. Her grip on my arm didn't loosen. I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "No, but I think I'm going to be." Bledsoe didn't go to a territorial judge. Whether Fitch talked him out of it or he decided the exposure wasn't worth it, I never knew for certain. Walt at the feed store said Bledsoe had gone quiet on the Denning land, which in Bledsoe's case was as close to a retreat as you'd ever get him to admit. Cora stayed. The spring was a working one. There was fencing to be done, and she was short-handed, so I helped. My 2 ranch hands helped. Her boys helped, even the younger one, who was 9 by then and had decided somewhere in the winter that being useful was the most important thing in the world, which reminded me of something in myself at that age that I hadn't thought about in a long time. I ate supper at her table more than I would have been able to explain to a casual observer. She came over to my place once or twice a week for no stated reason and stayed longer than neighborliness required. We didn't talk about any of it directly. That was fine with me. I have never been a man who needed things said out loud in order to know what they were. One evening in May, I was on her porch fixing the board that had come loose again. It was always going to come loose. The wood was getting too old. The whole porch needed replacing, and I was trying to figure out when to say that without making it sound like I was offering more than she'd asked for. And her older boy, the 10-year-old, his name was Price. He came out and sat on the step next to me and watched me work for a while. He said, "Mr. Cole, are you going to marry my mother?" I kept working. I said, "That's a question for your mother." He said, "I'm asking you." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Well." I put down the hammer and looked at him. He had Roy's eyes and Cora's jaw and the particular expression of a boy who has decided he's the man of the house and is taking it seriously. I said, "I think I'd like to, if she'd have me." He nodded. He said she would, I can tell. He went back inside, and I picked up the hammer and sat there on the porch for a moment with the weight of it in my hand, this ordinary tool and the boards of a porch that needed replacing, and the particular smell of supper coming through the window, and the sound of Cora's voice inside saying something to the younger boy, and I thought, this is what it feels like. This exactly. Not triumph. Not some big turning of a wheel, just this. I asked her in June, not with any ceremony. We were out at the fence line where her property met mine, and she was helping me check the posts, and I just said it. Said I'd been wanting to say it for a while, and I reckoned I'd been waiting until I felt like I'd earned the right, and I wasn't sure a man ever feels exactly that, so I was just going to say it now. She didn't answer right away. She pushed on the fence post she was holding, testing it, and then she let go and turned and looked at me with the clear-eyed directness she had, the thing about her that had been catching me off guard since November. She said, "You've been earning it since October." I said I hadn't been thinking of it that way. She said, "I know, that's part of it." She came to me and put her arms around me there at the fence line, just came to me, no hesitation, the way you go to something you've already decided on. Her face against my jaw, the smell of her hair and the cut grass and the wind off the plain. I put my arms around her and held on. She was warm and solid and real in a way that 9 years of quiet had almost made me forget a person could be. I felt the want that had been sitting in my kitchen all winter, and what I felt wasn't the ache anymore. It was the answer to it. She said into my collar, "The boys need a man to watch." I said, "I know, you told me." She said, "I was talking to you when I said it." I said, "I figured that out eventually." She said, "You're a little slow." I said, "I'm 58. She laughed. It went through me like something warm. We married in September. Small at the church in town, just the boys and Walt Greer and 2 of Cora's friends from the Women's Society and my ranch hands. Arvin Price was not there. Harlan Bledsoe was not there. That suited me fine. What I remember most about that day isn't any particular moment. It's the quality of the light in the church, which was late afternoon gold coming through the 2 west windows, and Cora standing next to me in a dress the color of sage, and Price and his brother sitting in the front pew in their good shirts looking solemn and proud in equal measure. And Cora looking up at me. There was something in her face, when she looked at me, that I had not seen on anyone's face in a very long time. Not pity, not charity, not the particular polite attention a man gets when people are being kind to the widower. Something else. Something that said, "You, this one, this is the man I chose." I have been looked at in a lot of ways in my life. I know the difference between how a person looks at you when you're useful and how they look at you when you're wanted. She wanted me there. Not just what I'd done in Price's office, not just the fence posts and the letter to the land office and the evenings at her kitchen table. Me, Gideon Cole, 58 years old, worn down in most of the ways a man gets worn down, not young and not easy, but here. I had not known how much I needed someone to look at me that way until she did it. The deed to the Denning property, Cora's property, our property now, all one parcel with mine, hangs in a frame on the wall of what used to be Roy's office. Cora put it there, said it ought to be seen. I look at it sometimes, not often, but sometimes. The territorial seal is clear on it, same as it was when I put it in front of Arvin Price, and the date reads 1862, and it says what it always said, that this land belongs to the person whose name is on it, and that the person whose name is on it came to it honestly and has the right to keep it. Cora's name is on it. Mine's on it now too, which is a thing I still find remarkable when I think about it directly. She came up behind me one morning, not long after we'd had the two deeds combined and redrawn, and she looked at it over my shoulder, and she put her hand flat on my back between my shoulder blades, just rested it there, warm and steady. I put my hand over hers. Outside the window, Price was working the near pasture with one of my hands, checking the cattle the way I'd shown him, moving slow and steady and reading the animals the way you learn to read them over time. The younger boy was visible further out, small in the morning light, carrying water toward the barn with the deliberate walk of a boy who has decided he's going to do this right. Cora's hand on my back. The deed on the wall. The boys working the land. That's all I've got, that's everything.